Howdy, this is Lemmy with RevZilla, here to talk to you today about changing shocks on your motorcycle. So you might be thinking about a fresh set of shocks for your bike for a number of reasons. You might be replacing some blown out tired parts, you might be looking to change the ride height in your bike, and you could also perhaps just be wanting to improve the ride characteristics of your bike. Now notice I said we're going to be replacing shocks on your bike. We have a twin shock bike, a Sportster over here, and that's what we're working on today. Those of you with monoshock setups, obviously things are going to be a little bit different, but for the rest of you, you should be able to follow along pretty simply. So before we get cracking on this very simple job, let's talk a little bit about difficulty. Even though this is a very easy job, typically requiring only 4 fasteners, it still bumps into our 2 beard category on our BSD, our beard scale of difficulty. The only reason this thing rates a 2 bearder is because you have to get the ass end of your motorcycle up in the air. So while you don't need a full-on lift like you can see we're using here, you do need some way to get the back end of your motorcycle up. So you'll notice we have a chock underneath our frame. You can use a chock like we've got there. You can have a buddy help you slide some wood blocks under there as you guys pick the bike up. Be careful. You could use a bike jack. You could also suspend it from overhead if you have a safe way to do that. There's a number of ways to get the tail end up, but that's the thing that pushes this into 2 beard territory. Other than that, it's a very simple job. As long as you can get your bike elevated, you should be set to fly with basic hand tools. So I'm going to show you the easy way to do this. There's a number of ways you can get shocks onto or off of your bike, but I've developed a way of doing it over the years that seems a little bit easier than some of the other ways I've seen other folks do this job. So we already mentioned step 1, which is getting the bike elevated just a bit. Now I want to expound upon that point for just a moment. Today we're taking off these shocks, these stockers, and we're putting on a shorter set of shocks. So that means we're going to need to move the swing arm up closer to the motorcycle. If you're doing the opposite, if you're making your bike a little bit taller by installing a longer shock, recognize you'll have to have the bike physically farther up because you'll need the clearance for the swing arm to drop down. So before I get started unbolting anything, one of the things I like to do is to have something to help support the weight of the wheel and swing arm assembly. This whole bit back here is pretty darn heavy. You got a wheel, you got a tire, a swing arm, a brake caliper, and rotor hanging out there. It gets fairly heavy, and once you start undoing these bolts, you'll wind up fighting the weight of those items, and you'll also notice when you get the last fastener out, this thing will slam down to the ground, possibly upsetting your carefully balanced bike. So rather than let that happen, it can be easier to help support this weight. We're going to do that today with some wood blocks and some shims. So I'm going to grab a block here, slide it underneath my wheel, and then I like to use shims for this next bit. These are just regular old flooring shims. You can grab them at your local hardware store for $1 or $2. They're pretty cheap, but I like to use them because they're wedge shaped. And what that means is rather than have to find a number of things that are just the right height here to relieve some of the pressure, we can simply slide a stack in here, and because they are kind of wedge-like, we'll get them in there, just slide them in, and now the weight of this, swing arm assembly is borne pretty well by those chocks and shims. Now's a good time to start unbolting things. So at this stage, I'm ready to start spinning some bolts off here. Now I generally like to loosen both bolts, crack them free. Let's get these things spinning here. So we've got this rear broken free, and then I'm going to move to the top and break that free as well. Generally speaking, I like to remove the bottom shock bolt first. And the reason I like to do that is because the top one will retain it and they'll just swing down a little bit. If you do the top bolt first, this whole thing has the opportunity to fall. So we're trying to prevent that pretty clearly. Let me back this nut off the back side here. We'll save that. Now, most of the shocks you're going to be installing probably will have you reuse some hardware, so don't go chucking that stuff on the scrap pile just yet. So I'm going to slide the shock bolt out here, and this can now hang free. Now, if you haven't done something to help bear the weight of your swing arm assembly, this is going to be a lot more difficult. Fighting the bolt out can be really hard. So that's part of the reason we're doing that. It made this job look easy, and it should, because that's the whole goal here, is to make this fairly simple. Now I'm going to repeat the process up top here and remove the upper shock bolt to remove the shock. So we'll spin this out by hand real quickly. Pop this puppy free, again retaining this bolt because we are going to use that as well on the new one. And our shock's off. It really is that simple. I'm going to flip over to the other side of the bike and repeat this process. Remember to follow that same sequence of events. You want to make sure that you start with the lower shock bolt first so you don't have the shock flip down and either hurt you or possibly bang up some of the pretty parts of your motorcycle. Now I've got the removal process complete. Both the OEM shocks are off of the bike, and the only thing holding up the weight of this swing arm are our wood blocks and chocks. Now remember we spoke a little bit earlier about possibly changing ride height here, and even if you're sticking with ride height, there can be slight variances between different brands of shocks in terms of length. So just because you have this thing shimmed out correctly for the removal doesn't mean it'll necessarily be exactly right for your installation. So the easy way to figure out where your shim should actually be is to loosely install one of the new shocks with the top shock bolt. So we're going to grab the top shock bolt here, and I'm just going to finger tighten this puppy into place so we can get an idea of exactly where it is that our swing arm needs to lie for this installation. So I'm just going to run this down by hand, nothing crazy, you don't need to get wild with it. So if you look, obviously this thing is a fair bit shorter than the shock that we had on this bike. So what we need to do is move this swing arm up. So you'll notice the shock will move in an arc once we have the first point fixed. So we basically want to get this swing arm attachment bolt here, this point, in the same arc as where the shock is going to swing. And the easiest way to do that comes back to our shim. So let's slide back here for just a moment. Now when I'm looking at this puppy, obviously I need to move this swing arm closer to the bike. So one of the easy ways to do that is, again, just slide those shims in a little bit deeper. So if you use something wedge-shaped, like we mentioned earlier, it'll allow you to quickly and easily just wind up, bringing the swing arm up just a hair. So I'm going to kind of check this out as I'm using that wheel to sort of suck those wedges through, and I think I'm getting pretty close right about here or so. Got a little bit more. Now from here, what I should be able to do is slide the bottom shock bolt in. So if you don't do this when you're attaching your new shock bolts, it's going to be difficult to get things lined up. You're going to be fighting the shock, you're going to be fighting all sorts of stuff, the weight of the swing arm. This is really the easy way to do this. So I'm going to get this nut on the back side of here and nut that thing in place. And from here, what I'm going to do is just tighten down some bolts, and I want to get these things loosely assembled. I don't want anything snugged down just yet. If there's any type of difference in height, or if you have loose swing arm bearings, or any type of a problem, having this side bolted down tight might mask it. So we don't want to run afoul of anything, or we don't want to have two different length shocks on here. That's a big problem. So we're going to get this loosely assembled and then switch over, and we're going to loosely assemble the other side as well. So let's run these bolts down. Not crazy tight, like I said, we're just getting them down loosened up, loosely assembled. So there's that side. And over here, we're going to repeat the process real briefly. Get my wrench in here. Now I'm going to get these bolts just loosely installed. And you can see we still have a little bit of play here, and that's important. We want to make sure that there's play on both sides before we start snugging down any bolts, just to make sure that nothing binds up in the suspension. That can be dangerous and also provide a pretty uncomfortable ride. Now pretty obviously here, we're going to need to duplicate this process over on the other side, loosely install everything. Keep in mind that should be a little bit simpler because you've already got the swing arm at the right height. The bolts really should just drop right in, assuming your swing arm bearings aren't totally destroyed. Once you've got that thing loosely installed, it's time to go back and hit everything up for final torque. Despite the fact you don't see me here with a torque wrench, I'm going to encourage you to refer to your factory service manual to use the supplied torque values there. Remember, suspension is a pretty critical component. You can be injured if you don't do this job correctly. Now we've got everything installed here. I'm ready to rock and roll on this motorcycle. Really all I have left to do is take this thing down and start riding it around. I'm going to remove my blocks and my shims, and I'm also going to take my chock out too. Keep in mind though, if you've radically altered the height of your motorcycle, you may see a need to modify your jiffy stand. If you've made the bike super tall by throwing really tall shocks back there, you may find that your bike leans over really hard on the jiffy stand side. Of course, the converse of that is also true. If you've slammed your bike way down, your stand might be a little too long, and the bike might stand very upright, close to tipping over the wrong way. Before you just throw the bike over onto your jiffy stand, make sure you check that out and you're comfortable with the way your bike is actually leaning. So now you're ready to rock and roll and you know how to change out a set of shocks on your Harley. If you want to do a little further learning, check out Common Tread. We have a bunch of suspension articles, including a really cool one we wrote, a 201 level article on the history of suspension with the Harley-Davidson Motor Company. Keep in mind too, you also want to subscribe to us. We're constantly reviewing new bikes, new parts, and new gear, and reporting back to you guys on how that stuff performs. I'm Lemmy, and I'm out of here.